Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Demai chapter 3, Halacha 5. The Mishnah has a wrinkle in it from something that we already learned. In chapter 3, Halacha 4, we were talking about if you're giving to an Amma Aretz for storage for your grain, you're a haver, and you're giving to the person who owns a storage company to hold grain, and that person happens to be an Amma Aretz, they're saying that you're going to get back your tithe. We're going to learn something new in this Mishnah. The exception to the rule is somebody who runs an inn, and we're going to get into why that is. The Mishnah says, one who gives food to the innkeeper must tithe that which he gives her and that which he takes back from her, because she is suspected of exchanging the food. Now again, this is different from what we saw in chapter 3, Halacha 4, where the Amma Aretz was trusted. The question that you're going to see is, hey, if you're giving a deposit of something, like food, to the Amma Aretz, are they trusted or are they not? And again, it's going to come up that this is the one exception. In this case, they are not. Now, the Rambam commentary is going to say that he's giving her raw food for cooking, and this was the common practice among people staying at an inn. And the Mara Fulda, by the way, this all is also going to be paralleled in Bavli Gittin 61b. The Mishnah here, says Mara Fulda, is referring to a haver who's going to an inn managed by the Amma Aretz. Now, the idea here is that, says the Rosh, that since the innkeeper is suspected of eating the lodger's food and replacing it with her own, the lodger has to tithe both the raw food that he gives her and the cooked food that he receives from her. And he must tithe the raw food that he gives her so that he will not cause her to eat untithed food, because that's, by the way, the Rosh, in the commentary in the Mishnah, he's saying that you know that they're going to switch it. And because they're going to switch it, you have to not put a stumbling block in front of a blind person. So if you know that she's going to eat it, or he's going to eat it, the innkeeper's going to eat it, then you have to go ahead and tithe it. That's why you're going to have tithes. And whatever cooked food you're getting back, you're going to have to tithe as well. Very expensive to do all this. So the Rambam has a slightly different approach. He's going to say that even after he tithes the raw food he gives her, he must tithe the cooked food that he gets back from her, because if she actually did replace the food with her own, the food that he gets back is going to be Demai. That's going to be the idea. Now, I want to look at Bavli 61b for a second. This also comes up in Hulin 6b. And there's a contradiction between this one and last one. This Mishnah is showing that the innkeeper who is an Amma Aretz is suspected of exchanging the food that she gets. And in the last Mishnah, the Amma Aretz is not suspected of exchanging the grain he receives from storage. So really, are the Amoratzim going to be suspected of swapping and switching food or not? The Bavli is going to give a very complicated answer that is actually going to be a debate between Rashi and the Tosafot. And by the way, the Rosh, in his commentary in the Mishnah, is going to conclude that the Yerushalmi here is going with the opinion of Rashi. Now, that's also interesting. Usually, the Tosafot is going to be showing the opinion of the Yerushalmi, but over here, the opinion of the Yerushalmi looks like it's going to be Rashi. So here's how it breaks down. The Bavli is saying like this, that in general, an Amma Aretz is not suspected of exchanging food, but the innkeeper is the exception. And why is the innkeeper the exception? Because she's going to rationalize that they're permitted to switch the food. And the nature of the rationalization is going to be the subject of this dispute between Rashi and Tosafot. So it's going to depend upon the nature of the exchange. And according to Rashi over there, the reason that she's going to exchange the superior food for her lodger's inferior food is she's going to rationalize there's nothing wrong with this since her intention is to benefit the lodger. In other words, to give the lodger value. According to the Tosafot, which the Rosh is saying is not the opinion of the Yerushalmi, which, by the way, already is odd, she exchanges, the reason that she exchanges her inferior food for the lodger's superior food, and yes, she's defrauding him by doing so, but she's reasoning that the services that she's already providing is going to be where she's going to have entitlement to his superior food. In other words, she's going to say, look, I cleaned the room and the bed is made extra nice and it's very, very comfortable and it's warm and it's safe and we give so much value. There's nothing wrong with me taking some of the superior food and switch it for some of the food that we have that's not quite as good. Now, the answer that's going to come back, and by the way, this is the view of the Tanna Kama, and unlike the end of chapter 3, Halacha 4, this gets back to the norm of this really is the Tanna Kama. In chapter 3, Halacha 4, at the end, we saw that Rebbe put down the minority view of Rabbi Meir and said it was the Tanna Kama, which it's not the Tanna Kama. And, Rebbe was the student of Rabbi Meir. He knows who, he had, his teacher had the minority opinion. But he did that in order to preserve the institution of tithing, like even what we see today. And it really changed Judaism because we would have ended up with a very uncharitable group of people. And, the Jews are the most charitable group of people in the world. Anyway, check back on chapter 3, Halacha 4, part 3 of the Shir, and you can see the debate on this mission over here. But over here, this really is the view of the Tanna Kama. And we go back to the Tanna Kama as being the majority view. The dissent here is going to be by Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says we are not responsible for swindlers, and he tithes only that which he takes back from her. So Rabbi Yossi obviously disagrees with Tanna Kama, and he's saying that the person who's staying at the inn has a responsibility to protect the innkeeper from a transgression. Sorry, that's the Tanna Kama saying that. Tanna Kama is saying you're not allowed to put a stumbling block in front of the blind person. It's assumed they're going to switch it, and you have to tithe it to make sure they're not eating untithed or not properly tithed produce. Rabbi Yossi is saying that since her act is immoral and is going to be fraudulent and she's exchanging the food, the lodger is not required to protect the innkeeper from the consequences of this kind of theft. And therefore, he does not need to tithe the raw food he gives her. Rabbi Yossi would agree, however, that the lodger must tithe the food that he gets back from the innkeeper in order to protect himself from eating and transgressing. So, it should be noted that Rabbi Yossi's reasoning is going to apply even if, as Rashi's holding, that the innkeeper's intention in exchanging the food was for her benefit and to benefit the lodger. And although in Rashi's case, her intention would be beneficial, her action is still fraudulent and still is going to exempt the lodger from the responsibility. That's the idea of Rabbi Yossi. Now, how are we going to prove all this? How do we know what to do with this? Because really what this is coming down to is, do you need to protect a swindler or not? You know there's going to be a switcheroo going on, but do you still need to protect them? So, Rabbi Yossi obviously is ruling in this Mishnah that the chaver does not need to tithe the raw food that he gives the innkeeper because he's not responsible to protect her or him from a theft. And, if the person goes and steals it, you don't have to protect them from the consequences of the crime. Tanna Kama says you do. Now, there's a parallel case, comes up in Meiser Sheni 5.1, talks about a dispute, exact similar case. goes like this. Tanakama, the Mishnah, rules that the owner of a grapevine of Orlah has to mark it as such. Why? To prevent people from passing by from picking and eating the grapes. So, again, you're not allowed to eat Orlah grapes. And Orlah grapes, by the way, would be, in the first 3 years. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is going to require this marking only during the Shvius year. Why during the Shvius year? Because we have a rule that this vine is not really yours, although it can still be subject to Orlah. But people are allowed to enter the field, and they're allowed to help themselves to the produce that's growing there. And again, that's not your grapevine anymore. So whatever's growing there in Shvius, people are allowed to access. But let's say you planted this vine 2 years ago or 1 year ago, and now the second year is going to be the Shemitah year, and there's going to be nice juicy grapes on there. And you have to, create access for people to be able to reasonably come onto the property and collect the produce, because it's hefker, it's not your produce. However, those people that are collecting the hefker are not allowed to eat Orlah. So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying you have to mark this, and only during the Shvius year. Now, during the Shvius year, this person who's going on there would be blameless. Now, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, and by the way, this is very similar to the ruling of Rabbi Yosef here. In the other years, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying you don't need to mark the grapevine on this protected field, because anyway, they're breaking into somebody else's land, and they're taking somebody else's definite property, and it's theft. And you don't need to protect them from the responsibility and the consequences of eating Orlah. And that effectively is the same reasoning and argument that you're seeing here. So the Gemara is going to go to this story about having to protect the swindlers, and the Gemara is going to say like this. Rabbi Yosef and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel both said the same thing. This, by the way, is regarding the Mishnah and Meiser Sheni in 5.1 regarding Orlah. And Rabbi Yosef, just as Rabbi Yosef said that we are not responsible for the swindlers, so too Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says we're not responsible for the swindlers. In other words, the guy on Shvius, he's blameless. Okay, he's going on the property. It's hefker. He doesn't know it's Orlah. And that's why you got to go mark it. You have to go protect that guy. And yeah, that's fine that it's not your property, but before it becomes hefker, you have to go mark the vine as being an Orlah vine, so people who are allowed by the Torah to come onto the property and eat the grapes free of charge as hefker can do it without eating the Orlah. But on a normal year, you're not allowed to go into somebody else's land and just go take it. It's a theft. Now, Rabbi Yosef would agree with Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel's ruling that one does not need to mark Orlah except during Shvius. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel would also agree with Rabbi Yosef's ruling that the Haver does not need to tithe the food that he gives the innkeeper, who is the Am Haaretz. Why is that? Why would Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel agree with Rabbi Yosef? Because, look, that person's not supposed to be doing a theft, just like you're not supposed to be breaking into somebody else's property and eating their grapes on, the fourth year of the Shemitah cycle. So too, you're not supposed to be, representing that you're going to be taking the raw food, cooking it, and giving it back to them, and then swapping it, switching the food, and then you either are getting the benefit, or, like as Rashi is saying, you're trying to take his not as good food and give him better food as a elevated level of service. And I suppose that in the real world there are two kinds of innkeepers. There are those who would switch their try to give a better quality of service and try to improve what he's giving, and also the kind of sleazy innkeeper who would be switching maybe better produce for produce that's not as good and keep it for himself. There are 2-star hotels in the world and there are 5-star hotels in the world, and I would expect at a 5-star hotel they might do something like that. But in either way, they're agreeing that it's fraudulent. You're not allowed to swap it. And in Jewish law, it's very precise. What you gave them, you have to be getting back. And either an upgrade or a detraction of what you gave them is a problem. Now, the Gemara is going to refine this, and it's going to point out the difference between Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Yossi, because it's not exactly the same opinion. It's almost the same, but not quite. So the Gemara says that it is reasonable to say that Rabbi Yossi would agree with Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. So that would be that you would have to mark your orla plants just before Shvius. That way nobody accidentally comes in and eats these hefker grapes that are still orla grapes. You can have both, you know. It can be orla and hefker, and you're not allowed to do it. The Gemara refines this and says, but Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel would not necessarily agree with Rabbi Yossi, and this is the explanation. It says that Rabbi Yossi would agree with Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel that it is not necessary to mark orla vineyards during the non-Shvius year. And that's because they're both agreeing that we're not responsible for thieves. We're not responsible for swindlers and protecting a thief from the consequence of theft. Now, the only reason to require marking these orla vineyards during the non-Shvius year, that would just be to protect a thief from a transgression. And since both Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Yossi agrees that we're not responsible to protect a thief from the consequences of his theft, which he shouldn't have been doing anyway, everybody would agree that you don't need to go mark an orla vineyard in a normal year. Okay? Now, and that's the reason why. You don't have an obligation. It's like, the stumbling block in front of a blind person. It's not really a blind person. This is a thief. So they're making a distinction that this is not like an innocent person who just happens to trip. The Gemara continues and says, but Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, although he holds that we are not responsible for swindlers, will not necessarily agree with Rabbi Yossi that the lodger may give untithed food to the innkeeper. And the reason is because it is not the practice of the haver to release from his possession anything that is untithed. Now, there's two really good explanations for this. I want to give both of them. One is going to be the explanation of the Mara Fulda, and one is going to be at the bottom of the Yerushalmi page, the Vilna Goan in the Beur Hagra. So the Mara Fulda is going to say like this. He's saying that if Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying that we hold that the only reason to require the haver to tithe what he gives the innkeeper is in order to protect her from this kind of theft, he would agree with Rabbi Yossi that since we're not responsible for protecting a swindler, the reason doesn't apply. But perhaps, according to Mara Fulda, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is holding that there's another reason to require the haver to tithe the food. And that would be an extension of the obligation in order to prevent a transgression. In other words, a haver must tithe whatever he releases from his possession, even when this tithing is not required to prevent a transgression. And therefore, says Amara Fulda, the haver must tithe that which he gives the innkeeper, despite not being responsible to tithe, therefore, to prevent the transgression. The Vilna Goan is going to sharpen that. It's going to really refine it. The Vilna Goan is going to say that the haver does not actually hand the orla over to the thief over there in Meiser Sheni. Rather, the thief is taking it by himself. And in this case, we're not responsible for a swindler. Okay? In this mission, the Vilna Goan says, however, the haver does actually hand his food over to the innkeeper. And this is conferring upon the haver a greater responsibility to prevent the transgression. And he must tithe what he gives the innkeeper. In other words, the Vilna Goan saying that if you're going to do it like this, then there's really a kanas. The sages are really putting a kanas on there, and that's why you're going to have to tithe it. In other words, according to this opinion of the Vilna Goan, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is actually explaining the reason of the Tana Kama. That's the brilliance of it. He disagrees. He would agree with Rabbi Yossi in the case of the Shemitah cycle on the Orlov vineyard. Okay? They would agree with that. But over here, the nuances and why and the cleverness of this insight by the Vilna Goan is that really Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is articulating the reason that the Tana Kama rules this way. And that is that over there in the vineyard, look, there's a protected field. The thief comes and helps himself. Over here, the haver is a haver, and he's handing over the goods to an Amma Aretz. And over here, there's a presumption there's going to be the old switcheroo. Now, this is the exemption on where there's going to be a switch. Over in the case of the boxes of grain, they're trusted. Over here, this is the exemption. And that's why this mission is necessary, because if you didn't know this and you went to an inn, you would assume that the halacha is going to be like chapter 3, halacha 4, that you get back your thing, you don't need to tithe it because the Amma Aretz held it. Not true. Over here, the halacha is going to be opposite. You do need to tithe it. The haver needs to tithe it again. And why is that going to be? Because that you have to tithe it because you're handing it over. And the haver is actually handing the food over to the innkeeper. It's not like the thief breaking in and stealing it. And they're effectively putting a kanas on this action of him parting from this tithed food and giving it over to somebody who's likely going to switch it. And that's why he's going to have to tithe it again. Have a great day.